Welcome to the third workshop. Tonight, we're going to talk about business models and to a large extent, stitching together a lot of the pieces we've already discussed in the previous two workshops around problem identification and kind of your solution, and then what that market and opportunity might look like. And so the business model is a means to really start thinking more broadly about all those other pieces that need to come together so that you can actually tell those stakeholders, customers, partners, investors, early employees, how you're actually going to get this done and why it's going to make sense in terms of your ability to bring your product, your solution, your technology to your customers. So I think, for those who don't know me, my name is Tom O'Donnell, Senior Director of Innovation Initiatives, and I have the pleasure of running the Innovation Hubs here in Lowell, up in Chelmsford, as well as teaching on the faculty of the business school, teaching innovation entrepreneurship courses, technology commercialization. So hopefully be able to share some insights from that tonight and help you really think through taking what you've done so far and taking it to that next stage. My partner in crime tonight, Professor Hunter Mack, over in the Mechanical Engineering Department, and a big focus on energy and combustion technologies. So if any of you have any needs to connect to engineering students to be part of your teams, Professor Mack can actually help you do that, and is already doing that for some of the teams. So why don't we jump in? As I mentioned, when we talk about business models, it's the how of how you're going to take your solution to those problems and actually bring it forward in a way that convinces folks that you want to engage with that what you're doing makes sense, that it can be potentially profitable, that it can be sustainable, and you can put all those pieces around the team, the partners you need, the customers you need to engage with, and the money you're going to generate to actually make that venture, as I mentioned, profitable and sustainable. Because if you can't convince folks that that's the case, then what you're doing is probably going to come up in many ways. So seeking investment, seeking partners, seeking customers, they're going to look at you and say, doesn't make sense. Definition of a business model. You can read this. And effectively, it's how you deliver that solution in a way that's sustainable and identifies not only what you're solving and how you're solving it, but who you're solving it for, how you're going to deliver it to them, and how you're going to generate revenue that allows that to make sense, and all those costs that you're going to incur in actually doing that. And that, so when somebody is looking at your team, I mentioned somebody, a stakeholder, an investor, an early customer, early team members that want to potentially work with you, and other key stakeholders, they're scratching their head and they're saying, yeah, interesting problem that they're trying to solve, interesting solution to address that problem, and compelling revenue models overall. But they're scratching their head and saying, okay, can this team actually deliver the goods on that opportunity? Yeah, they've identified a problem. Yeah, they've identified a potential market, a customer that needs it. But can they actually deliver? The discussion around the business model focuses on that overall. And it's ultimately looking at how that idea actually addresses the problem and navigates this timeline, which is shown here linearly, but it's never linear. But for the sake of discussion, let's look at it this way. And so looking at those stages of that process around going from the idea to the impact, and going from that idea to a prototype, to a first product, to a larger scale product, and ultimately getting to the point where you are established in the market and have something that's credible. So that idea, very early on, eventually gets to the stage of impact. And all those pieces you pull together allow you to do that. And all those pieces you put together help you, and this is where it gets interesting, help you get over all the hurdles and all the risks around the technology and product, around the business, around the team dynamics, and potentially other things like regulatory hurdles and government hurdles that you need to get over. How many of you right now are looking at something that requires approval from government agencies for you to move forward? Hands up. Okay, what are you working on?
Satellite?
Yeah. So satellite technology, where you're probably going to need licensing from the government agencies to actually deploy that, right? Are you guys all working together?
Yes.
Okay, anybody else? Anyway, the point is, as you're putting all these pieces together, there are all kinds of different risks. So that business model that you put in place, there's no guarantees that that business model is going to make you successful. But if you frame it that that business model is going to allow you to identify these risks and start knocking them down and eventually position yourself for success, that's the best you can hope for. Because there are so many unknowns, so many of these risks that you're going to have to get over to eventually get to the point where you can deliver that product, that solution to the market at the right price point, leveraging the right partners in a way that's got the right value proposition, so that when you put it out there, those customers, those investors, those partners say, yep, I want to work with these folks. I want to invest in these folks. I want to buy from this team overall. And that's where the business model comes into play.
Dr. Lydon.
Question? Let's go back.
So, one thing that might be useful at this point is to talk about business models that are not successful, right? So jumping ahead a little bit, thinking about the fact that business models are not rocket science, right? All of you in this room can understand what goes into a business model and follow everything that Professor O'Donnell is going to talk about. But what's hard about it is to understand all the interrelated places where you can get hung up. So it may be useful
So
to
do me a favor. Hold that thought. Good. No, good. Finish up. To the end of the slide. I know where you're going.
I want to hear a bad business model, just so they can know what not to do. I have one in my head.
There are plenty. Let me see which one I can. All right. It's before all of your time. But, do you hear of pets.com? Okay, pets.com? No? Haven't? You've heard about it, right? What's the gist of pets.com? Back in the internet bubble days, early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s.
That's why I don't want to reach out.
So pet supply, online retailer, and at the time, the early days, their whole business model assumed many things. First off, the customers wanting to buy pet supplies would do it online, which is a fairly good assumption, right? But also that the ability to get the right products for their pets without human intervention, for instance, at a pet store, would work overall. And also, their business model required a ton of money to actually build out their website and their delivery mechanism in a way that would make it compelling at that point in time. Now, their timing, you could argue their timing was not very good because the internet bubble burst about a year after they came to the market. They also spent a ton of money in ads at the Super Bowl back in 2001, which basically prevented them from investing in a lot of other things, like getting folks in the field to work with some of these veterinarians and other thought leaders overall to get things kicked off. And ultimately, they went out of business. Anything else to add?
Pretty much what it is.
It's crazy seeing all those companies that get millions and millions of dollars investors come in.
Right.
And they all just disappeared off the market.
So market timing, but also business model, when they put it out there, the market wasn't ready for them. The investors weren't ready for them at that point in time. Now, the fact is, they also suffered from a bunch of other hype that kind of flamed out at that point in time. But the business model didn't work out at that stage overall. Do you have another example?
Well, for bad business models, I can give you my company.
Yeah.
That I was at prior to returning back to the right? So when I was in, where are you? I can talk loud. After I got out of graduate school, I was part of a team that founded a solar company, right? What's the most expensive part of the solar panel? What? There's no batteries in solar panels. What makes the energy? The cells. The solar cells is the most expensive thing. So our brilliant idea was, if we make a solar panel with less cells, most expensive part, therefore it'll be cheaper, right? And so we were replacing cells with optics, right? We had a plastic's cheap. This was in 2007. And the company's founded, raised $2.5 million pretty quick. Built prototypes. So we did this. We had idea and concept. We had prototypes. We had patents. We had our first product. But one thing that we didn't foresee coming was a large assumption that we had made that made us non-competitive in the market. What happened in the solar market in about 2008, 2009? Solar cells became cheap, right? And so the part of the module that we were attacking nosedived in cost. So our module wasn't as attractive as it was at that point. Now, our business model is great. We were able to raise millions of dollars. We were able to have a totally functioning prototype, patents out the wazoo, but we didn't understand the market totally, right? Some of that stuff you can't see. We don't have magic balls, we can see everything. But the idea can be laid out. But you have to be able to understand where you might get attacked at. And had we seen that a little bit earlier, we might have been a little bit better off. Now, so those are two examples of bad business models. What's an example of a good business model? Something that happened, and just looking at this, simple. Idea, concept, first sales. Yes? Tesla. Okay? I know a bunch of people.
Hold that thought.
That's a good one.
We're going to talk about that
But let's
in a bit.
stay in transportation. What did most of you use at least once a week? Uber or Lyft, right? Fantastic idea. Saw a hole in the market, expensive transportation. Saw an easy easy access to cheap labor, and they're able to execute it in
less than 5 years into a billion-dollar company, right?
So in that situation, enabling technology that disrupted an existing model, which effectively was either public transportation or private vehicles, turned more into the sharing economy overall, and required a shift in user purchasing patterns and adoption patterns, but ultimately enabled, instead of being a vehicle company, what they are is a transporting people business, getting people from A to B. And so if you back 100 years ago, if the train folks who were in the train business, railroad business, really understood that they were in the transportation business, not in the railroad business, they potentially could have transitioned and started building planes and other things. Now, there's challenges around that as well. But as we're talking about this, it's putting all those pieces together that allow you to achieve revenue, profitability, market share. All those things that make you sustainable. So when we think about your business model, it's thinking about not only the technology build-up, the market identification, which we talked about in workshops 1 and 2, the problem and solution, and the market and customer side of things. But it's the execution piece, the team piece, around putting all those pieces together. Out of those 3 buckets, technology, market, team, where do you think the biggest failures for a new venture come into play? Let's let somebody else. Out of those 3 buckets, which one has the biggest source of failure for new ventures? Out of those 3, pick one. So business model? Maybe. The execution piece, the team piece, because it's taking those business models and being flexible with them, because that first business model that comes into play is probably not going to be the one to get you to the end zone, to get you to success overall. But identifying that initial business model and moving that forward actually is extremely important. So the product, the market, the team is all about the what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're actually getting it done. And so when we look at these 3 pieces, as you shape this up, really start thinking about how your technology and your team have the right synergies. That product, technology, product, and team fit overall. On the market and business model side, and your team, do you have the right team to actually execute on that market and business model side of things? And ultimately, we've already talked about this piece, that product market fit. Workshop 1, workshop 2, and bringing them together overall. And as a team, thinking through these 3 elements is extremely important. And that business model is kind of that roadmap that helps you navigate these 3 elements overall. Does that make sense? So a little bit of business 101. Because this is where those elements of the business model start to come together more clearly. So your team, your company, your venture, with that product, that technology, that solution that you want to bring to the customer, to the market, in a way that's compelling and has value. and value that allows you to address a pain point, to make things better for those customers. Painkiller, vitamin, and ultimately differentiates you from either existing solutions or differentiates you in a way that gets your customer to move forward away from things they're already doing. It might not be exactly a competitive offering, but it's something they're already doing to address that need. So your job is to make them move towards your solution and away from either competitive solutions out there or what we talk about as substitute solutions. Things that may not be exactly like what you're doing, but it's something that customer is doing to address that need in a different way. Getting from A to B, if you're in the transportation business, and you're coming up with a potentially a new vehicle, your customer may not be looking for a new vehicle. They might be fine with riding a bike, flying a plane, or leveraging Uber and other solutions that don't require them to actually purchase your transportation solution. If you do that, they'll pay you. And if you do that effectively, what they pay you covers the costs. You can be profitable and ultimately be sustainable in your venture overall. All these elements tie into the business model. And this applies to both for-profit as well as non-profit. The difference being a for-profit is, let me rephrase this. The difference between for-profit and non-profit is a legal definition. If you are a non-profit, you still better care about generating excess funds from what you're doing so that you can sustain your venture, your nonprofit, and invest in growing, expanding, scaling up overall. The difference is a for-profit and a nonprofit. For-profit, you can take those profits and share them with your investors. A nonprofit, those excess revenues need to go back into the venture. They cannot be dispersed to anybody else other than that nonprofit venture overall. That make sense? And that product, that service, or both, is what you're delivering to that market, and hopefully in a way that they'll write a check and engage with you. Now, here's the thing, as Professor Mack talked about, that solution does not necessarily need to be a hard product. It can be more of a service. And so as you put that out there, really think through how your solution that's not a product is competing with hard products overall. And so your ability to deliver can be a lot less capital intensive, cash intensive than what they're doing. So your ability to get that to the market much more quickly and in a fashion that your customers will adopt more quickly can be pretty interesting. Does that make sense? Questions? So let's build this out a little more. As a company, getting your product into the hands of your customer. What's the most widely understood way of convincing your customer and getting a product to that customer overall? potentially retail,
Or an app store.
but in the early stages,
Oh, it's all you.
it's all you. So direct sales, to get out there, to work with those customers, to convince them of your product and its value, and then work with them to get that product delivered to them. Very costly to actually do that. What if you could work with a channel partner to help you do that? And a retail store or an online presence is effectively a channel. And if you engage a channel partner, you have to share the monies. Any money that gets generated from that sale has to get shared. But it does not require you to invest so much in that distribution piece, that sales piece, that customer engagement piece overall. There's a trade-off in that. On the back end, you need to work with suppliers and partners, manufacturing partners, to help you potentially design, build, manufacture that product. Back 50 years ago, companies did everything, soup to nuts, designed the product, built the product, sold the product, supported the product, did everything. That was their business model, soup to nuts. Today, very few customers do that. Doesn't make sense in many ways. Because, first off, you may not have all the expertise, but you may not want to do it because it requires you to not only design and build the product, but be the best at distributing it and supporting it and marketing it. That takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. Or just convince Walmart to stock the shelves with your product. Just convince Amazon to put it in their online stores. Make sense? In many cases it does, but you're giving up some of that control overall. That's part of the business model. And another part is who those investors are actually going to be. How are you going to generate those funds? Where are you going to look for the resources you need and convince them to invest that money in you? Because don't kid yourself. All these pieces, your competitors are trying to do the exact same thing. So how you put these pieces together overall in a way that makes your venture compelling because you understand not only what you're doing, who you're doing it for, but how you're actually going to build it and manufacture it either on your own or with partners, how you're going to give it to the customer either on your own or with partners, how you're going to support it either on your own or with partners, and do that sustainably over the long haul. That's the business model. How to put all those pieces together. Now let's think a little more broadly. Your business model also needs to take into account a lot of those broader dynamics that exist in the market, in the industry that you're working in, that potentially could give you a tailwind and help you, or could potentially hurt you and put you out of business. Professor Mack gave a terrific example, okay? Terrific example of market dynamics in the solar space, that if that startup understood there was a broader dynamic that was potentially taking place and getting traction, potentially would be a different decision about whether to move forward. And we'll touch on that in a second. Pestle. Anybody want to venture to guess? What's the first P in pestle? I'll give it to you. Anybody? Political dynamics. Okay? Political dynamics. And what I mean by that is the environment that you're looking to sell into, is it stable politically? Are there issues you need to understand? Does your business model need to take into account the risks associated with these political dynamics? Oops. You just saw it. Economic. Okay? In the economic environment, back in 2007 to 2009, here in the U.S. and worldwide, was one of the worst economic conditions since the Great Depression. If your business model doesn't at least understand that something like that can happen, and you need to be flexible in that model to adapt to those conditions if they arise, shame on you. S. Social. Very good. Social, in terms of dynamics in the product space that can either help you or hurt you in your venture. Lots of great examples. Can anybody come into some type of social dynamic that can take place that will either help you or hurt you? What do you think?
If you have a product that you're touting for only one specific gender or sex, and it becomes part of the social ultimately not.
Okay. Sure. Good one.
I think smoking comes from that.
So smoking. So smoking is a great example because he talks about the social dynamics that are pushing back on the adoption, right? There's another issue around that as well. That's a great example. What about, go ahead, one more.
Social media.
What do you mean by that? Social media?
So if your product does something that society really likes and it gets promoted on social media, you get really popular really fast.
Yep.
Or
Okay.
vice versa.
So the social dynamic might be that more and more people are much more open to leveraging social media and sharing all kinds of private information about themselves. So a business model that asks somebody to share their private information, like Facebook and others, right? Could be pretty compelling versus 15 years ago, that wouldn't get much traction. Let me give you one more example. The aging population. If you have a product that's targeted for elderly folks, medical device, pharmaceutical, some type of therapeutic solution that can help somebody retrain themselves after an injury. From a social standpoint, understanding the dynamic of the aging population may provide you with some insights that position that in a specific market space. Make sense? T, I'll give you this one. Technology and the dynamics around that. The next E, environmental. Who said that? Very good. Lots of issues and to understand with that, including support for clean energy technologies, but also regulations and policies that could shift pretty quickly. And it ties into the political stuff here in the U.S. With the Obama administration, a lot of support for clean energy. Existing administration, not so much. Right? Know that. And the last one, the legal and regulatory stuff that you need to know about. So ultimately, your business model needs to focus on putting all those pieces together in a compelling way that allows you to address all the risks that position you for the best success at the point in time where you're bringing your product, your solution to the market. Does that make sense? So let's take a step back. In addition to the business model, you also need to understand where you play in the market overall. If I go back to this, at its most simplistic side, well, let's go this one. You have what we refer to as a value chain. Suppliers providing you with materials, subsystems, stuff that you take, like the Mack or the materials, that you then build your solution and then deliver it either directly or indirectly to your customer. So the value from the materials to the product, to the distribution, to the end customer, at its most simplest form, defines what we refer to as a value chain. So your business model takes into account what that value chain actually looks like and how you interface on the back end with the suppliers and on the front end with your customer directly or your partners in the channel to work on that distribution, getting your product into the hands of the customers. So an example, the automotive space. I'll put this up there very quickly. So, each one of the industries that you're looking to position your product into has a value chain associated with it. It goes from the most simplistic raw materials all the way up to finished product and then getting it into the hands of your customer. Automotive space. Everybody understands the auto space to a certain extent. It's very tangible. Raw materials like rubber, oil, sand, getting turned into glass, steel, plastic, then subsystems, the engine, lights, the shocks, then into the broader system, the electrical, the ignition, the power system. Then gets turned into the vehicle itself, and then gets sent out to the dealers, ultimately into the hands of the customers. Each one of you needs to understand where you play in the value chains in your industry. So the first point is, how do you define that? And at the most simplistic side of things, and let's just throw this up here. Most companies play in one of these spaces. So in its most simplistic way of looking at it, you need to understand the folks who are right behind you, providing you with materials, subsystems, electronics, PCs that you're going to then put some software on, whatever. But then understand who you're going to need to deliver that to. Now, in most cases, you're probably delivering that directly to your customers. But you might be delivering it to somebody who's going to take your thing and then bundle it with something else and then deliver it to the customer. And I would suggest, if you haven't thought about that, think about it. Because that partner with your product might bundle it with some other technology, but in most cases it bundles it with some services. It makes it easier to get that product into the hands of the customer and then supports them longer term. So you don't have to build that up overall. So if you're moving into the medical space, there's probably a partner that you could work with who understands that space a lot better. If you're moving into the education space, there's a partner who can wrap some services around your thing, who understands that space a lot better. So as opposed to convincing a customer, you have to need to convince that partner that you get some good stuff overall. Questions? So, most customers, right here. Some customers do multiple of those spaces, like Tesla, who originally was a car company, but they couldn't find good enough batteries in the market. So what they said was, can't buy it, I'm going to build it. So they went backwards and effectively reverse integrated in the value chain and said, we're a battery company as well. Interesting about that is they now also forward integrated and they actually are their own dealers. They didn't want to take their company, their cars, their vehicles, and put them out into existing dealerships. Why do you think that was?
To the customer cost.
Customer cost, potentially. Yep.
Dealers hold monopolies in the states. They're the only ones authorized to sell the cars. So they're also allowed to markup as well as in the offering.
So markup, yeah. Rights in specific spaces, yeah. I think there's in some cases, a more compelling reason why they try to do this. Those absolutely compelling pieces. Because with this new vehicle, with new capabilities that are still not fully fleshed out, they wanted that direct relationship with their customers. Why do you think that was?
Education.
Exactly. They could educate their customers, but as importantly, their customers could educate them. They get it out there, they're working with their customers say to them, hey, this ain't really working the way it should be. Is it easier to get that feedback directly to you or through, in this case, through a dealer? Obviously, directly to you. So, value chains, very important part of your business model because it says where you want to play in that value chain. Let's do a quick exercise. So, Tesla, and then back in the early 1900s, Ford did everything, soup to nuts. They had their own forests of rubber trees. They had their own beaches where they could get sand. They had everything. Take the raw materials, turn it into parts, build the subsystems. Had the River Rouge plant here in Michigan. Can you think of any companies that do that today? Everything. Soup to nuts, including engagement with the customer from a sales and support standpoint. Any customer. I'm sorry, any company today. General Motors. Do you believe that? No, not even close. Because they're working with a lot of these, what they call tier 1 and tier 2 OEMs. I can't name any, quite frankly. So your challenge is figuring out how you play in the industries that you're trying to work in. So let's grab a sheet of paper and spend no more than 10 minutes to just sketch out at the simplest level, you, your customer, potential channel partners that you're going to work with to help distribute, and then the suppliers on the back end that you're going to need to work with. This exercise, as I mentioned, is all about trying to understand at the most basic level who you're going to need to work with to help you get your product in the hands of customers, so downstream, and then who you're gonna need to work with to help you build your product on the back end, equipment, supplies, materials. That's the most basic level. Now there's all kinds of additional details to flesh that out, which is important if it informs your business model. But once you get beyond that one level behind you, one level ahead of you, don't sweat it too much, except, and we're having a discussion here up front, if you were selling your stuff to somebody who's going to integrate it into a solution and then sell it to the end customer, it is extremely important for you to understand as much as you can, not only your customer, but your customer's customer. So fleshing this out in more detail at that next stage, you will absolutely benefit from that. Questions on that? Does this make sense? Business model, when we talk business model, it's not what you're doing, not why you're doing it, but how you're doing it, and inserting yourself into an industry in a specific way with all the resources around you that's going to make it compelling, profitable, and sustainable to keep you going overall. All right. How many of you, did we bring any of these?
Yes.
Yes, right, great. Why don't we send them up, pass them up? When we talk about these things, like our product, our customer, the value we bring, how we're gonna actually get that product and that solution in the hands of the customer, either directly or with a partner, like a channel partner. How we're gonna work with our suppliers. What are we gonna charge our customers? And what is it gonna cost us to deliver our product to those customers overall? So what's being handed out to you right now is what's referred to as a business model canvas. And it's a nice shorthand that frames all these pieces that we've been talking about. Guys, listen up. So, sorry, I went too much. So one of the things that the Difference Maker program is here to do is to not only provide you with some coaching, some education, but access to some tools. I'll turn it down a little bit. That better? That better? And this canvas, I think, and the Difference Maker team thinks, is a terrific tool to help you navigate this crafting of the business model. Because it takes those 9 elements that we've been talking about and puts it on one sheet. And it doesn't assume that you have all the answers. But it does assume that when you go out there talking to these stakeholders, that each one of these elements are going to be important to share with those stakeholders. The investors, the partners, the customers, the early employees, those government agencies that you're gonna need to convince that what you're doing is not breaking the rules or won't interfere if it's something having to do with regulatory environment. It's not gonna interfere with or break any of the existing regulations overall. So here's the key. Trying to put in place all of these pieces in a way that's compelling with those three big ones that you already touched on. The solution, the customer, and that value that you're bringing. So, you're the company doing this. Looking at the customer and delivering that value. And if you do it in a compelling way, they're gonna write you a check. So when we look at this, at its most fundamental stage, if you can't answer these three pieces in the context of the business model canvas, what you're doing by virtue of your capabilities and how you're applying them to address a need in the customer base, the market, and clearly differentiating and articulating that value. If you can't clearly do that, you're dead in the water overall. But beyond that, it's how I deliver that product, that solution to the customer, either direct or with the channel, and then who do I work with on the back end to help me do what I need to do overall. So here's a tool to help you do that. And at this stage, you all have assumptions on what those pieces actually look like. It's probably not the end all, be all. But right now, what we're gonna try to do is walk through each one of these buckets and then talk about sketching out some of this for each one of your ventures. So as we're walking through each one of these buckets, try to think about how it applies to your venture, to your company. Question?
What if I don't know how to fill one of them out? I don't know the answer. Can I just guess?
Yes. This is not assuming you have all the answers. This is more to get you thinking in a way that positions you for answering all the questions that are going to come up as you get out there talking to more and more people. So, to Professor Mack's point, we're not assuming you have all the answers. In some cases, you may not have a lot of them. This exercise is to try to think in each one of these buckets, what are those pieces that I need? And using some of the stickies, let's walk through some of these in more detail, and then we'll go through an example. So customer segments. How many of you think you understand your customer overall? So, talk to it. Hang on one second. So these customer segments define, hopefully, groupings of potential customers that, if you ask the question, if I solve it for one, I can solve it for all of them in that group. And when I talk about solving the problem, I'm talking about how to position that product, that solution in a way that if I put it out there for one, I can put it out there for all of them in that segment with very little or no changes. So the answers, who's desperate for that? What problems do they have? And overall, being as specific as possible in terms of who those people are, what their problems are, and how my solution is mapping to their need. So you have a very specific customer segment defined.
Yeah, we're getting there. We never age 18 to 32.
Yep.
Highest uses of Apple smartphones. We'll probably spread that out a bit more at some point, but a lot of it is like gaining money, investing in savings for retirement. So if you're like 50, 60, you've got no investing, then you should invest. So it kind of goes out scale right now. The other aspect is that we have some social media integration. And 18 to 32-year-olds are way too young for that. And they're more likely to invite friends.
So in that 18 to 24, 34 demographic, 18 to 34? 32. Demographic, you can very clearly understand buying patterns, specific needs, what they're doing today, challenges that they have, income levels overall, what they're doing today to think about their financial planning, and that defines a customer segment. So by virtue of that, you can now think about how does my solution fit in to that customer segment, and is it addressing their needs in a way that's compelling and maps to that demographic nicely.
Why is it important to have an initial customer segment?
Why is it important to have?
You just solve everything for
Hang
everybody
on,
all the time.
answer. Because, so that's the answer. You asked an answer. If you think that you're gonna build one and it's gonna be applicable to every situation, in every case, for every customer, everywhere, that's probably erroneous thinking. Let me give you one example of the closest to that overall. Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola, soft drink with a specific formula. You make it once, sell it worldwide, right? Build it once, worldwide. Why is that not correct?
Different formulas have different.
Now, hang on. Think about the customer.
Some people don't drink it. Other places, it's probably the most viable source of liquid that they have. It's cleaner than the water supply or something.
So, okay, but think about it more in terms of kind of customer demographics. In the back. Yeah, that's the big one. Tastes change in different regions. What's another issue? Potentially. So yeah, economics, access to the funds to purchase, right? US versus rest of the world. One more that comes to mind. Competition, yeah.
How do you get it there, like distribution?
So, yeah, so distribution, absolutely, different distribution, but what if I wanted to build it in country? Access to those resources. But I couldn't agree more on both those. Competitive landscape, but also, if I build it, make it here in the US, how do I get it there? Or, if I make it in country, then what are those issues? All right. So, customer, why do you think the value proposition is smack dab in the middle of this? Come on. Why is it right in the middle?
Why would you buy it? That's a key point. Why would you buy something?
Because it's the most important thing. And if you don't get that right, all these other pieces, it's gonna fall apart. Now you can force it, but if that is not clear and crisp and hits the mark, the rest is gonna fall apart, right? So in that value proposition, make sure it maps to those customer segments. And you could potentially have multiple value propositions. So do one of these potentially for each one of your customer segments. Potentially. Now, each one of those will look a lot similar, will have a lot of similarities in the other buckets, but don't be afraid. So here, right? Map each one to each customer segment. Because we already said there's no such thing as one customer segment. And here's the other thing. Do you know the difference between a feature and a benefit? A feature function versus a benefit. What do you think? Yeah. So the feature is what it does. The benefit is why it's important to your customer. Okay? So the benefit is it's faster, it's cheaper, it's more efficient, and allowing me to solve my problem. And it allows me, it addresses that need from a business standpoint versus, yeah, it does this, it does that overall. So when you're talking about value propositions, it's benefits, not features. Benefits, not features. Now the channels, we've touched on this in significant way. Question? Yeah? Yeah? No, it's not. Value proposition is not what it's going to cost them. What it's going to cost them flows from the value proposition. But the value proposition basically says, why do they care about me? And how much, why and how much do they care about me? Right? They care about me because my value to them and how it addresses their problem, their need overall. Channel. Go to direct or through a channel. If you go through a channel, understand that there's benefits, but there's costs. There's pros and cons. Going direct in the early stages, I would strongly recommend for everybody. Because going direct early allows you to engage with those customers who are going to help you refine your product, are going to help you understand if what you're doing really maps to that need in the market. But going direct has costs. Fielding people in the field, direct sales folks, to go out there and go face to face with those customers. Excuse me. Costs money. It's compelling. The other thing to keep in mind, question, ties into the value prop. The value chain. If you go into a specific market and there's an entrenched way of how customers buy their products, how they get their products, it's easier for you to fit into that than to have to reinvent how your customers get their product. The medical device space and the medical space more broadly is a big example, a great example on that. Hospitals, and doctors buy 99% of their products and solutions through distribution. So if you go into that space and try to convince them to buy direct to you, good luck. It's not going to work. So your challenge is not to go direct, but understand the distribution partners and get engaged with them as quickly as possible and convince them to carry your products. Make sense? Customer relations. Even though you own going to the market, delivering that product to the customer, to the channel, and the channel is bringing that to the market. In the case of a channel partner, in all cases, indirect or direct, you own the preference for your product in the market. So, getting out there via marketing and engagement with the market. It's up to you to set that preference and make sure that you understand what they care about, why they're going to buy, and what's that overall value proposition to them in a compelling way. If you don't own that, if you don't make sure that you understand why they're doing this and purchasing that product, shame on you. This talks in many ways about your marketing strategy and how you're going to get out there, either fielding your own messaging or tying into messaging from your partners overall. And we could talk weeks or months, full courses on marketing strategy overall. Suffice to say, you own it. Make sure you keep that going.
So revenue stream. So the next portion below the value proposition is, so if you provide value proposition, what you do for the customer, how are you going to make money, right? Now there's a bunch of different ways that you can do this, right? Revenue streams can come from direct sales. You make $100 by selling your widget. But there's other ways. What other kind of revenue models might one have? Licensing, excellent. What else? Spotify has subscription models, excellent. So there are a bunch of different ways you can make revenues. You can solely just sell your patents. You can have a company that comes up with great ideas, makes patents, and just sells that, doesn't even do licensing, right? There's a bunch of different ways you can make money in the end, and it all depends on what type of company you are and what makes sense. Now, it's very often that there are multiple different ways you can do this, right? There's a bunch of different ways. You could have subscription service. You could have buy it and then you're done type of service. But it just depends on how you want to set it up. Okay, so there's no, people always look for the right answer, and sometimes the right answer starts as one thing and then it shifts down the line as you become more established. I like Tom's comment, caution on licensing, right? Licensing oftentimes is a default thing. Yeah, we got this great idea, we're going to license it to everybody. It's usually not that simple, so be careful if you decide to use that.
To that point, licensing assumes that you're going to license away your tech, somebody else is going to take it, run with it, deliver it to the end customer, right? It also assumes that you're going to be negotiating with that company that's licensing your tech. If you do not understand the value of that technology to them in that end market, how are you going to put a value on that licensing deal? So similar to what we talked about up here, understanding your customer who you're licensing to, but understanding your customer's customer Because the real value of that license is not what they're paying you, because they're gonna try to push it out. It's the value they're gonna get when they bring it to market. And what you really wanna do is take a percentage of that. And that's the argument. And if you don't understand that, you're at a disadvantage in that negotiation.
All right, and then to the left of the value proposition, you have key resources and key activities. I'm gonna lump them both together because both of these are necessary, that's the word key, are necessary to be able to, for you to achieve, to be able to deliver your value proposition to the customer, right? So it's very important at this stage in the game, if you've got this great idea, what do you need to be able to do that, right? Is it programming, right? Is it solely money, right? You've got to raise money, that's one thing, okay? That's a good activity, go out and raise money. But there's other things that you need to be able to do to be able to realize your product. Being able to identify those both in terms of resources and activities. Some of that, which, I mean, they're very related because activities take time, time equals money, right? So it all comes back to money. But being able to identify what you need to be able to achieve that or be able to deliver the value proposition is very important.
Okay, just a touch on that.
Word brand.
Here's, as a startup, consider yourself startups. Do you have unlimited time, unlimited money, unlimited equipment, unlimited resources, unlimited? If you did, okay, it'd be a lot easier. When you start talking key resources, key activities, articulating not only what you need to do, but the priorities in which you need to do it, that's part of this as well. And so it's critical that you flesh out the key, not all the activities and resources, but the key ones, and make sure they're targeted on the right stuff.
Right, and so understanding that there's a conservation law, engineering speak here, so there's some conservation that has to be applied to this, right? You do not have infinite time and or money. So given your non-infinite time and money, what is the most important, okay? Coming from somebody who started 3 companies now, right? You have to be able to rank that because you have to have the time to be able to do what's most important. Some of the stuff is like value added, nice to haves, but may take a lot of money, so that slides to the bottom, okay? Cost structure, so we talked about how you were going to make money, so that would have been, oh, that's revenue streams next, we haven't talked about that yet. So cost structure.
We talked about revenue.
We did this one already? All right.
We talked about revenue.
Good. Putting the pieces together. Okay, so we covered everything at this point? All right, so by this point, you have a pretty good summary of what each of these boxes is. And like I tried to give Professor O'Donnell to say earlier, it does not matter if you don't really know the answer yet. The best thing is to get your best guess down at this point. Because I guarantee you that it's going to change. Every company changes their model. I'm just talking what I think you should say. Hey, look,
Because you're starting with a guess. That's because if you don't put a stake in the ground with what you think you know now, then you're not going to be able to move forward. And I can't tell you how many times startups die because they get stuck with analysis paralysis. They start, well, what do I do? Where do I go? Wait, put a stake in the ground. Boom. This is what I think about these things right now. And then, move forward. Some of them are going to be valid, some aren't. Focus on the more important ones. Keep going, and eventually, you get to the point where you've got the critical mass, and you have all the pieces that you're going to need to convince those key stakeholders, the investors, the partners, the early employees, all the folks that, now, don't assume you're going to walk up to them and put this down in front of them and say, hey, there's my model, give me money. No, that's not the case. This is a tool for you to understand, frame stuff,
Well, it's a tool for you to understand where the holes are in your understanding, right? Like, and it doesn't matter if you don't achieve what you put down here, right? So, you're all too young and I was too young, but anybody remember the Apple Newton? Right? So the Apple Newton was the first tablet,
Before
right?
its time.
Yeah, they were totally,
Before its time.
great idea, right? Probably well executed, I don't think I've ever played with one, but they missed the boat. Technologically, it couldn't do everything that they wanted to do. It wasn't very fast at that point. But also, market timing was wrong. So they pivoted. They went back and they put it in their back pocket and they came back, right? The classic example for a lot of this is the iPhone, right? What's the value proposition of the iPhone?
So as many as possible.
The value proposition for you as a customer. What do you get out of it? Makes life a lot easier. Mobile computing. You can combine multiple devices. You don't have to carry around your calculator, your phone, your iPod. You don't have to carry around that. It combines it into one. So there's a very distinct value proposition. But to identifying the customer segments part, right? Who was their initial customer segment? Does anybody remember what the cost of the first iPhone was? Yeah, it was like $800, and then they had all this stuff. It was very, very expensive. So their initial target was what? The early adopters that would pay for all that money. Now, what's the problem that they're having? What are you seeing then? They're trying to drive the cost back down so they can reach a larger segment, right? So they didn't go for the wide adoption. They built the market. They built all the people being able to use their ecosystem, and now they're trying to broaden that base. So being able to identify where your value proposition slots into the particular customers, and you'll be all right. Okay? Yeah, you had a question?
No, you went.
Oh, I did. You have a question? Nope. All right. So, what's next?
Exercise. So what, the canvas, along with the stickies, just jot down as quickly as possible what you think you know, and let's focus for now on 3 buckets. Customer segments, value proposition, 4, let's focus on 4. Customer segments, value proposition, potential partners, and potential channels. So, what you have is important. To whom, how you're going to get it to them, and who you're going to need to help you. This canvas is a tool for you to organize your thinking about the business opportunity overall. How you use this information is up to you. But if you don't get to the point where you flesh out these items to a sufficient level of detail and then validate them so that you truly understand how these pieces come together, you're going to be at a disadvantage.